Well, good morning, everybody. This is Scott Morrison. I'm CTO and Chief Architect of Layer 7 Technologies, and this is Practical API Security and OAuth. And I'm really happy to have here today Eve Mailer talking with me. So, quick couple of housekeeping things we got to talk about at the very, very beginning, and we'll get started. First of all, questions. What we're going to do is, if you have anything that you want to ask either myself or Eve, put it into the chat button on your WebEx console, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And I'll promise if there's others, I'll try to go through them later on, and one or the other of us can maybe get in touch with you over email or something like that and answer them. And of course, Twitter today is a major thing that we're trying to bring to bear in this webinar. So there is a hashtag, which is #L7webinar. And of course, down here also, you've got our own Twitters, myself, Eve, the Layer 7 Twitter, and Forrester as well. So with that, let's actually start to talk about API security and OAuth. Now, I've got to tell you, I've done a lot of webinars. And if you're on our mailing list, you've probably noticed that too. There's a relentless pace of Layer 7 webinars, probably about one a month. Our whole group in marketing loves to put them on. And no doubt there's been times when you've sat there and thought, God, not another Layer 7 webinar. And your fingers hovered over that button, that link that says unsubscribe. And you've thought to yourself, well, you know what? Maybe I'll give them one more day. Maybe I'll give them one more chance. And let me tell you, it's a good thing you hung around. Because I can't think of a time when I've been actually more excited about an upcoming webinar than this one right now. And what I think says more than anything how timely this topic is and how interesting the guest is with Eve Mailer is that we've actually got probably double the signups that we normally get. I tell you, we had to get a bigger room. They have rooms in WebEx, and we actually had to upgrade. This one is so popular. So let me try to give you a sense of why I think this is such a timely topic and why I think this is going to be a really good one. And let me ask you, first of all, have you ever been sort of considered one of those young Turks? Those people who are kind of at the forefront of technology, brash and confident, and really riding that new wave of tech. I mean, the community in general loves young Turks. I mean, we, as a group of people in technology, really like that approach where we jump in and try something new. And a very important part of the whole young Turk equation, really, is to turn your back on the past, is to sort of say, well, you know what? That was my grandfather's technology, and I'm not even going to look at it. I'm going to reinvent everything as we go along. And I got to tell you, I've been there. I've been there at the beginnings of SOAP and the WSR stack and everything like that. And I tell you, the last thing we ever did in those days was to look back at Corba and things like that, because we, of course, knew better. Now, the thing is that sometimes when I look at stuff like OAuth, I get kind of worried, because I sort of look at it and say, you know what? Eventually, they're going to get to everything that Eve Mailer's already thought of. And that's why I'm really excited about this whole thing, because, you know, Eve really represents continuity between the days of the beginnings of identity and everything like that, but she's still very, very much involved in exactly what's going on and is going to guide us through this whole thing of OAuth and this whole new approach and hopefully bring a lot of this experience. So we're lucky to have her in the community, and I'm lucky to actually be presenting with her today. So without any further ado, I want to turn it over to the smartest person in the room. Eve, take it away.
My goodness. Well, I'll stop blushing now and just introduce myself to you very briefly. Thank you all for joining today. I am a Forrester principal analyst, and I serve security and risk professionals. And I focus on identity and access management, federated identity, secure web services, business-to-consumer use cases, and privacy enhancement techniques and technologies. And I look forward to getting folks questions and comments at the end as well. Now, I'm going to ask my colleagues over here at Layer 7 to be driving the slides for me. So if you can turn to, I guess, slide that says number 2. I've got a technical problem today, so I hope you'll forgive me. The takeaway that I want to leave you with today is that API economy technologies and habits, just ways that people are, maybe young Turks, maybe the way young Turks are starting to affect how enterprises do things. And I see this trend as a little bit similar to consumerization of IT. I almost think of it as the web devification of IT. That is to say, a lot of things are getting simpler, and the danger with simplicity is that you have to question, well, what does that mean for security? So today I'd like to talk a little bit about knowing where the pressures are, new pressures on securing web services, and getting to know the best solutions. And I think that OAuth is a key part of that. And so with that, I'd like to turn to our agenda slide on 3. So the way I want to go about this is talk a little bit about the way web services are opening up and the ways in which the word ecosystem is really not just a buzzword, in ways in which it really has a good meaning. And second, I want to delve into business requirements, business scenarios, and use cases, and a little bit of tech from real-life examples of folks that I've talked to in our security and risk practice here at Forrester. And third, I want to leave you with some practical advice about ways to approach OAuth and think about OAuth and ways that you're likely to come across it. So if we can turn to slide 4, Scott made wonderful reference to the sort of decade plus of distributed computing architecture wars with Corba and DCOM and then SOAP. And before even the WS Star phase, there was this thing that was called WUST for a while, you may remember, which was, I think it was WSDL, UDDI, and SOAP technologies or something like that. And that sort of graduated into a conversation about SOA. And so there's been this, you know, the terminology kind of shows how our thinking has evolved from web services to, now there's this word API, this acronym API, that used to mean something a little bit different, and now it really means something fresh, which is likely to be a published, possibly open API, and possibly the starting point for developing a third-party developer ecosystem for some value that you're trying to monetize that was previously locked into proprietary data formats, proprietary services within your company. So, you know, there's so many ways in which people are doing this for real business. It really isn't just for toys. So, you know, in retail, you know, Best Buy has APIs, and Sears has a developer network, and eBay has a very well fleshed out API strategy. You find content developers and streamers, Netflix and, I don't know, Comcast and USA Today, folks like this having these open APIs. And perhaps strangely in financial services, folks like ING and Intuit are pretty friendly to this new notion of pretty lightweight APIs that involve engaging people in engaging with you on a machine-readable basis. I actually find that very exciting. And then the question is, well, how can you control this? So if we turn to slide 5, here's the new challenge in a nutshell. It used to be the case, if you had a sort of classic enterprise a long time ago, that IT security architects would have quite a lot of influence and, let's say, control over line of business developers, to the point where in-house developers would ask, can I deploy this? And, you know, your security architect would say yes or no. So they kind of owned the relationship in a much stronger way than they're able to in the modern world at the bottom of this diagram, where you have developers out there you do not control. And the reason that you're making those APIs available is generally to stimulate business. It's almost like it's a top line or profit center concern, not a bottom line or cost center concern. And so these developer customers of yours, there's many more of them, they're very diverse, and they may in fact be kind of more inexpert in some cases than folks you've been used to working with. And yet they're coming to you to say, look, I demand this simplicity from you, this ease of use from you as a developer. And you have to respond to that. So you're much in a position of, I'm going to say, a more even power relationship with these folks. You're not just the department of people anymore, essentially. So on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about how Forrester characterizes this new world of the extended enterprise. We really have 3 dimensions of challenge. And I'm just going to rely on Sarah or somebody to help me with the builds here. The first dimension is that you've got services that are moving off premise. So whereas you might have had something within your physical boundaries, you might have a private cloud that lives elsewhere, or you might have a multi-tenant situation. So your enterprise resources that you consider sensitive may no longer live with you. So that's one complication. A second dimension of complication is that the users who need access to all of these resources are often using mobile devices of their own choosing, unmanaged devices of various kinds, devices that just live on a continuum of your control. And third, the third dimension is that you've got a lot of external users trying to access your resources. And this is typically where we start to think federated identity. And this adds up to complexity. You know, if you were a classic enterprise that had everything on premise and everything was under control, you'd kind of be at this, in this virtual cube, you'd be at 0, 0, 0, and that would be nominally easy for access management. But if you're somewhere other than 000, and there's just a million points in there, you really need what Forrester calls a zero trust security approach, which means you just treat everybody who's requesting access as untrusted. And at the end of the day, what this means when it comes to identity and web services security is you need to audit and enforce access in all of those directions all at once. So next slide is just, we'll move on in our agenda, talk a little bit about where OAuth came from and why I think it's so very important for business reasons and also for attractive technical reasons. So on the next slide, we have a couple screenshots here. Web 2.0 players originally came up with the OAuth thingy by codifying what they were already doing in sort of current practice, and they were trying to solve what they called the password anti-pattern. And so you can see here from these screens is Twitter was one of those involved. And so the idea is that they have kind of a third-party app gallery, and you're seeing the app gallery that I actually have, of third-party apps that I've connected to talk to my Twitter account essentially on my behalf. And the mechanism, I think this might be a build, is that third-party app with which I want to forge this special relationship redirects me to Twitter to log in and consent to make this connection. Now this is really kind of exciting. The whole point was redirecting and then coming back with something that isn't necessarily exposing to, in this case, YFrog, my Twitter primary credentials, my username and password. Well, they know my username, but not my primary credential in terms of my password, is an improvement in security. And it's a very simple model that turns out to be quite generative. So some positive things about just solving this password anti-pattern that folks like Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and Google kind of jumped on, AOL, Yahoo, others, is that it's cross-domain, it's web scale, doesn't have any grand ambitions, which usually speaks well of a standard that's trying to gain a foothold. It codified current practice, same thing. And it had cloud service providers and Web 2.0 providers, not technology stack vendors and middleware stack vendors driving the conversation. So you knew it was going to be adopted. So if we can move to the next slide, this is going to be really tricky because we have a build here, and I'm hoping this will work for all. So what's so powerful about solving this password anti-pattern is it turns out that it lets you achieve in a very simple, web-friendly, RESTful fashion what amounts to delegated constrained access from one app to another. So YFrog, by not getting access to my Twitter credentials, doesn't impersonate me. Rather, it acts on my behalf in a kind of binding between it and Twitter and myself as permissioned by me. So the first step is really that YFrog and Twitter, this is the authorization server and resource server, form a relationship that they can at least mutually identify each other correctly. Oh, sorry, I'm saying this wrong. The resource server role and the authorization server role in OAuth, actually Twitter would run that itself. So it separates these components architecturally. They can be further separated, but typically Twitter just runs those. So you've got the actual Twitter API responding to an internal authorization server that Twitter runs to allow access depending on user granting access. So that's a first step. The second step is that I, XML girl, will go off to YFrog and say, yes, I would love to have you connect to my Twitter account. The third step is that it sends me over to Twitter to authenticate and grant access authorization. And Twitter can then, in the fourth step, deliver to YFrog an access token which substitutes for the primary credentials. And this access token has a nice property in that it can be refreshed over time so that it actually helps you with entropy concerns. And then finally, if YFrog wants to do something on my behalf with the Twitter API, it goes ahead and accesses in the fifth step that Twitter API, which is protected, and it accesses in a way that says, I'm YFrog, but I'm acting on XML Girl's behalf. That's really very powerful. So moving along to the next slide, I want to talk about what are the implications of this for your business if you have web services that are either internal or maybe operating in an external ecosystem environment. The first thing that it enables you to do is it gets client apps out of the business, as I say, of storing passwords. That's actually a biggie. Not that the secret it's storing is completely, safe to share around, but it's much better not to spread password copies around. Secondly, it allows for a variety of user authentication methods. OAuth is primarily an authorization protocol, not an authentication protocol, and it has had the foresight to prepare for both web apps, methods of authentication, and also native apps that have special needs and special usability and security properties. So what Forrester calls the app internet is very well served by this approach. Third and fourth, we have app access allowed to be tracked on a per-client basis. So YFrog gets an access token that's unique to it. No other Twitter client can get an access token like that, so its activities can be tracked on a granular basis. And if it goes rogue, you can actually revoke its access privileges. And it also allows for least privilege access because OAuth has a thing called scopes, which allows you to say what smaller bundle of API calls this particular client app, in this case YFrog, is allowed to make. So least privilege access is one of the important tenets of the zero trust security approach, and this granularity is good overall for not giving too much access. Next, it can capture explicit user authorization, which has interesting implications for privacy and privacy compliance. It basically allows a person to authorize a connection by actually taking some action, and that can be recorded. Next, it lowers the cost of secure app development because it's so simple. There's actually, I'm going to put it this way, even though I'm XML girl and I love XML, there's no angle brackets in this stuff. It's gets, it's posts, it's very simple formats. People get it, and you don't need to buy sophisticated tools necessarily unless you want higher order functions. And finally, as a bonus, because it's so generative, this basic pattern solves a much larger class of needs, as it turns out, around security, identity, access, and privacy. And we'll take a look at those in a moment on the next slide. So the original use case for OAuth was indeed for consumer-facing scenarios. And this, I've got a swim lane diagram here, which may look a bit like an eye chart, but what I want you to take from this is an example from real life. eBay is one of those who actually has an API that it presents, and it allows for a third-party ecosystem of productivity apps to support eBay sellers so that you can list items, manage who's bought what, for example. And so these third-party apps want to connect to eBay on the seller's behalf with all those great security properties and authorization properties we were just talking about. So, and they're not going to be impersonating that user, they're going to be representing the user. So this is a real-life example. And the flow is interesting in that, you know, once the third-party productivity app gets the access token and can make calls, the seller, the user, might be around or might not be around when they're making those calls. They might still be around in a user login session, but they might not be. Now, Twitter is a great example of how you can sometimes own both ends of this transaction. Twitter has native apps that it makes available, for example, on the iPhone. And so Twitter owns the horizontal, Twitter owns the vertical, and so it connects both ends, but it still uses the OAuth pattern because that avoids your having to store your password in the Twitter app on the phone. So again, it avoids this propagation of credential copies. So on the next slide, we look at some not consumer scenarios, but really extranet partner scenarios and even SaaS scenarios. And this is a case from real life, again, with a construction firm. And my understanding of big construction firms that do things like build dams and things is pretty much no one firm, as large as it is, can possibly do everything alone, and you need to partner with heavy equipment firms, and there's a lot of joint ventures involved. Now, each one of these businesses, they'll all come together for a project, which may end up being a year or two or whatever it is, but each one of them is willing to serve as an identity provider for its workforce. So in this case, you've got the construction firm and you've got one of the partner heavy equipment engineers on, and they've got a tablet of some sort, and they want to get into some app that involves using the API that the construction firm exposes. Now, this person has a tablet that was issued to them. They're already logged in as an employee of their company. What this flow of OAuth allows is bootstrapping into OAuth, getting that access token by means of SAML single sign-on. And there's already well-established profiles that explain how you can interoperably connect up SAML, end up with a SAML assertion, basically a token, and exchange it for an OAuth token, and then you're off to the races. So what's going on here in this case is not explicit authorization, but it's really implicit authorization because that person is not a free agent acting on their own behalf on the internet. They're an agent of their company, and their company is authorizing the connection for them. On the next slide, we have a really interesting use case that was never really explicitly intended by OAuth, but has turned out to be extremely productive and popular. And that is doing single sign-on with OAuth itself. Now, what you see here is this is something that, again, eBay is planning to do. It's planning to use the fact that OAuth, in an eerie coincidence, has this delegated authorization flow, logging in and consenting, that looks an awful lot like classic redirect-based cross-domain web single sign-on. And because eBay has a whole bunch of properties like StubHub.com and Rent.com and a bunch of other domains, it wants people who want to use those sites, which it owns itself, to be able to use their eBay ID at all of them. It's classic single sign-on, in this case, kind of internal consumer-facing single sign-on. And so it basically leverages the OAuth flow to kick off a user login explicitly based on the login and, what may be after the initial time, some truncated consent process. Now, it turns out this is appealing to traditional enterprises as well for lots of reasons in the internal federation pattern. But I've got a couple of builds here which show that if you look at this Sears.com login, Sears itself allows for federated login not just from, actually not even from other Sears properties, but from totally third-party properties like Facebook and Twitter, and I don't know if you've advanced the slides all the way, but LinkedIn is another one. All three of those and eBay, in addition, actually do use OAuth in this pattern. So like I say, very popular. The others that are shown there, Yahoo and Google and MySpace, initially start with the OpenID technology, and some of them even proceed to OAuth after that point. Okay, the last scenario that I wanted to review is a slightly esoteric one, but very, very interesting, and we do have real-life examples. And this is what's frequently colloquially called the two-legged OAuth scenario, meaning application to application, or so many people use different terms. This is where, that terminology argument catches up with us. Some people call this server to server. Other people call it just client to server with no user in the picture. But app to app will do for now, or maybe two-legged, even though it's not really, they're not legs, they're more like parties or something. And the way that eBay actually uses this pattern of OAuth is, okay, there's not really a user in the picture if you've got a lot of low-level web services, like, for example, calculating a sales tax when somebody lives in a certain place, or formatting a shipping label, or validating a hunk of HTML. Those are just little low-level tasks for which they have internal web services. They're not intended to be exposed outside, but they have good reason to want to secure those interfaces because they're a very sort of open to the internet kind of company, and to audit what's going on and to catch rogue apps and broken apps and be able to revoke access one by one. So what I've done in this picture here is show for the first time the inner workings between the authorization server and resource server. And what's going on is the calling app, which is some little web service, says, look, I want to use the shipping label formatting service. So the calling app can identify itself. It doesn't have a user to identify as well. So it just says, look, here I'm logging in. Think of this as a kind of an HTTP auth, basic auth substitute. And it gets in return an access token that it can use to make the API call. Now, the gray arrows on the left on the bottom are the internal communication between the protected resource server and the authorization server. And I really am geeking out here. Hopefully you guys are all with me and digging this. And what's happening in a proprietary fashion, essentially, is that that token is just treated as an opaque string, and what it gets back internally from the authorization server is some understanding of whether it should let the guy in or not. Now, this is a really great, I would submit to you, a great zero-trust architecture versus the kind of silent OA gateway where you just immediately go to the resource server it basically is more flexible, but it requires more front-loading than a sort of classic SOA security architecture. And so because OAuth is simple enough to sort of get on board and get started with, I'm seeing, eBay is one excellent example, and there are a couple of others that are just superior in their ability to sort of turn their enterprises inside out. And one of them even said, I consider us not an enterprise with an internet presence, but an internet presence with enterprise goals. That, to me, is zero trust thinking, and it's very powerful in terms of securing everything to the level you need, no matter how internal you thought it was. So I want to proceed in the agenda to talk a little bit about some concrete advice around leveraging OAuth, while just being mindful of where, it's a security technology, but it's not a perfect one, it's not a quite finished one, and there are just things you always have to be aware of. So whether your ecosystem is internal or very broad, keep in mind that simplicity doesn't have to equal insecurity if you use good OAuth practices. And there's quite a lot of them. I know that Layer 7 has talked in the past. A number of other companies with experience have shared their best practices. Here's what I sort of consider my best practices. If you are a security and risk professional with responsibility for the server side, that is to say you're doing something like publishing APIs or exposing single sign-on on this basis, here's some advice. The first thing is you really have to establish user experience standards for the consent ceremonies that users experience, no matter whether they're coming in through a web app or a native app client. This is difficult to do, but if you want consent to be, in the words of, I think, the EU, meaningful, informed, and uncoerced, you have to give people the best shot at understanding what they're being asked to permission. And actually, despite the fact that you might think Twitter is a toy, they've done a very good job, especially in recent months, of crafting consent messages that convey what that connection will allow the app to do, what it won't allow the app to do, and what its benefits are. That's number one. Number two is OAuth actually has a couple versions. There's OAuth 1, and actually there's a 1.0a that was standardized by the IETF, and there's an OAuth 2 that's sort of nearly complete in the IETF. They have different security properties. OAuth 1 sort of specialized in digital signatures over messages, and that made it pretty strong, and it was prepared for a world in which you might have an HTTPS option over which this messaging could flow to secure your API. And that was great, and Twitter actually still uses that today, but it was perceived that the signing process complex. And so OAuth 2 actually has an option that looks like bearer tokens over HTTPS. And so you're going to have to judge your own ecosystem, whether it's internal or very widely dispersed, what they will tolerate and what you can ask them and make them do in terms of all the toggles and switches for security. And finally, on the server side, if you depend yourself on password authentication, so if you're like in the Twitter position, remember that OAuth doesn't change anything with regard to phishing and password stealing. So any kind of static secret that you're relying on as, say, one-factor authentication, you're still at risk for people, stealing those credentials, those primary credentials, and then using them to forge app-to-app connections. If you use something stronger, then you're protected from that. More advice, if you're now responsible for developing client-side apps or responsible for the security over client-side apps that access somebody else's OAuth-protected API, the first thing is, well, OAuth tokens and other secrets involved, like client credentials, those are secrets, and you should treat them like secrets and store them securely, tokenize them, encrypt them, do what you need to do. Secondly, keep in mind that this is a redirection protocol in the main. And so you've got the client app sending the user over to the Twitter equivalent to log in and then return. And the callback endpoint that the user should be sent back to is something that you can pre-register with the authorization server, and that's a very good idea so that it's exchanged out of band so that a rogue client app can't intercept. And finally, if you're going to use any flavors of OAuth that involve cryptography, this is just general good advice, don't go and re-implement the cryptographic bits. They're well-known, well-tested libraries, and those should be reused. And that's just good policy in general. Okay, just a couple more slides of material here I want to present. So who's this fellow on the next slide? Forrester does everything in a role-focused fashion, so I serve security and risk professionals. And to remind me of that, we have this persona called Sean Rhodes, get it, SR. And he's here to help us find the next steps. How can you maximize value if your future has OAuth in it? Well, first thing is, does your future have OAuth in it? Do these scenarios resonate? Are you looking for and yet at least equivalent security ways to do these patterns? So the first thing to do is take a look at that and see which ones you'd like to exploit yourself. The second thing is ask which of your SaaS providers are in a position to force your hand. You may have discovered this already. Google has a number of OAuth-protected APIs. Facebook has basically turned the knobs tighter and tighter in terms of third-party apps that are integrating with Facebook, and Twitter has done the same. they had this moment where Twitter turned off basic auth, actually, it was last year, a year and a half ago, and they called it the OAuth-calypse, because everybody was so worried that it would go horribly, and it didn't go horribly, so now they're OAuth-only connections. Third, if you're going to be publishing openly your own web APIs, you need to figure out, okay, your ecosystem has certain requirements and constraints, and you have your own security requirements and constraints. Consider which of those knobs you can turn really high for security and which you have to relax, and what best practices you can advise your ecosystem to follow, and how you can maybe help them with an SDK if that's required. Fourth, you need to partner with your enterprise architects, because chances are you've got a pretty fully fledged SOA infrastructure internally. It's probably WS star enabled. It's using a lot of XML back and forth. You've got a token handling strategy for getting access. If you were to add OAuth to that mix, what would happen? And there's a number of things that could happen depending on sort of how radically you go towards it. And that needs to be planned. And then finally, you know, OAuth 2, the ink isn't quite dry. It's pretty close to dry, but it's not quite dry, to be honest. There's a bunch of people who are profiling for their needs, and this comes from the cloud service providers. Salesforce is a good example, really innovating around, I have this problem, I need the solution. It was Salesforce and some other folks who came up with the SAML to OAuth bridge, for example. So if you feel you have a need that isn't covered yet, chances are it's going to be solved pretty soon by sort of a consortium of folks out there who really have the same problem as you. So one more slide, you know, so if you're going to accept some volatility and keep an eye out for what is going on out there that's interesting, I wanted to point out that OAuth has some very interesting near futures with regard to this native single sign-on use case. OpenID Connect is the name of a new version of what is being branded as an evolution of OpenID, if you're familiar with that technology, but is really kind of a gutted version of OpenID that isn't OpenID anymore at all. It's not the OpenID protocol. In fact, what it is the OAuth pattern with a standardized identity data API that it's protecting. And these specs are not really very long. They're pretty easy to absorb. They've been working on making it very developer accessible. And what's most particularly interesting in the substrate there, the underpinnings in this picture, it includes not only OAuth 2, but a new suite of specs that are called JWT. I was worried I shouldn't call it JW star. I suppose bad memories with the star. But so JWT stands for JSON Web Token. And what's interesting about JSON Web Token, even though it's very nascent, the S is signature, the E is encryption, the K is public key, and the SWD is for simple web discovery. What JSON Web Tokens are is kind of SAML strength tokens, assertions in JSON form. And I think that this has the ability to really affect things quickly in a very non-linear way because of the affinity that web developers have for JSON and the lack of affinity that they seem to have for XML, point taken. So that concludes my remarks. I will turn it back over to Scott, and I look forward to your questions and comments after that. Thank you.
Well, listen, thanks, Eve. That was really, really interesting. What I'm going to do now, actually, is let me scoot back a bit, and hopefully you can see some of the slides that I'm going to go into. I'm going to set up a scenario that I think is going to be kind of interesting to a lot of people here, and then I'm actually going to do a demo, because one of the things that Layer 7 is working on right now is building a lot of the tools and infrastructure that actually allows you to embrace this volatility, that allows you to actually work with OAuth today, but also recognize that things are changing. We're in one of these kind of interregnums where all of a sudden there's a lot of chaos in that, and things haven't quite settled down yet. That doesn't mean you should be ignoring OAuth. In fact, we should be embracing it. We should be those internet, organizations, at least, with enterprise aspirations. Because the truth is that this is a really good technology. It makes a lot of sense. And as much as possible, what I want to do in my role is to give you the tools that you can actually use to actually implement OAuth today and make it very, very practical. So let me run through a very, very quick scenario first. And I'm going to echo really, I think, a lot of what the basics of what Eve has said here and kind of show you a few of the major components in here. And first of all, really what I want to nail down is a little bit about the different terminology here, because I know when I first started going through OAuth, one of the things that used to trip me up a lot was the use of terminology here was a little bit different. Client, in this sense, of course, was something like one web app trying to get a hold of another web app, as opposed to maybe a thick client application or something like that running on my laptop. It's amazing how much, preconceived notions in that can sometimes trip up your whole perception of what a technology is about and where it's going to be used. So what I'm going to do is kind of as an anchor here is use a great example of Twitter and Facebook, and what you would do if you actually wanted to take Twitter and have your tweets published on your wall in Facebook. Now, let me say, first of all, that neither of these companies is a Layer 7 customer. They actually do this all themselves, and they're actually great innovators in this space. But the reason I'm showing them is simply because most people use these two apps, and I think they show better than anywhere a great canonical example of OAuth kind of done right. So the client in this case, of course, is going to be Twitter, and it's going to be actually publishing tweets on the wall on Facebook. And so Facebook is going to need two different things. Number one, it's going to be the resource server in keeping with the whole REST concept of representation and resources and APIs and things like that. It actually gives you that API that you can actually push a tweet to or push some kind of information to that'll actually show up on the wall in Facebook. The other important part of it is the authorization server, which is that component that actually allows you to, as a user, actually set up that link between those two resources, between Twitter and Facebook. And when I move into the actual demo that I'm going to be doing, which is a separate application here, hopefully you'll get a sense of exactly where we play and what Layer 7 can actually offer in this space. So let's quickly look at the Twitter and Facebook example again and kind of look at what it looks like. And I borrowed some slides from my friend Stephen Mack here, who's a product manager here at Layer 7. So this isn't actually what I look like. This is what Stephen looks like. And you should go out and friend him right away because he's a good guy, and I know he's listening as well. So this is what Stephen's Twitter page looks like. And when it starts out, of course, you can see that there's no connection directly to Facebook. So in this scenario, really, the first thing we've got to do is think of Facebook as the authorization server. We have to establish that relationship with Facebook so that our tweets can actually go down there. So what we'll do is we'll connect up to Facebook and make that request for permission. Say, I actually want to allow Twitter to access basic information and also post things to my wall. So when you look at this, actually, this is part of the ceremony that Eve was telling us about, the ceremony of actually being quite clear in terms of what permissions you're actually granting as a user from your client application, which is Twitter, to an actual resource, which is Facebook in this case. And of course, Facebook has taken a lot of heat over the years for privacy policies and things like that. But this is actually a pretty good one. This is actually pretty clear. And the actual ceremony of allowing and not allowing is actually, quite self-evident, actually. So now let's flip back to Twitter, and all of a sudden we see that within Twitter as a client, we've actually got a link in to Facebook where we've actually authorized access to it. And quite literally, it's as simple as that. If we want to maintain that, of course, because if it's not enough just to simply set it up, we may get to a point where we realize, you know what, I just don't want that happening anymore. I want to consolidate my use of different social media and maybe break some of these links. Anytime I can, go into Facebook again and actually start to maintain that link, change that. And so that's part of that whole life cycle of that permission that you're actually giving, that link that you're actually creating between these two sites. It actually goes through that whole kind of life cycle. And so, of course, Facebook gives you exactly the capabilities of going in and maintaining that. You can go and actually break that link or maintain it or change the permissions. So the important thing about this whole idea behind using OAuth as a key component of the whole security system around your resources and your APIs and your services is that it does also give you the facilities to maintain exactly what those relationships look like. And sometimes that can mean things like cutting somebody off, like really implementing that zero trust model, where all of a sudden maybe on one site you recognize that another site has been compromised. And so all of a sudden you have to cut that off. And it may not be you as a user cutting that off anymore. It may be you as an administrator of that. It may actually be the administrators of Facebook that recognize that all of a sudden somebody's account at Twitter has gone rogue and they need to be cut off. So this, giving the tools to the right people, both security administrators, but also the developers, evening that playing field, as Eve pointed out at the very beginning, is very much about what OAuth infrastructure is about. So that's really one of the things that I'm going to take you through right now. So what you really need as you pull all of this together is you recognize that there's a lot of different components that actually need to be pulled together. It's both things like provisioning and approval flow and the persistence of tokens on the client side. But also, actually, as you move over onto the authorization side, you really need to be able to not just handle that integration, but also maintain that whole life cycle of those tokens and maintain the life cycle really of that relationship. And then finally, you really need a very, very good and easy way, ideally, of actually handling the security around your APIs. Ideally, what you want to do is drop in the components that you need, drop in the enforcement infrastructure so that it makes OAuth simple and easy to use. That's exactly what we're trying to do really with Layer 7. Now, Layer 7, if you know our roots, has been always in the SOA XML gateway world. But really, we've evolved the technology into a much more kind of rich gateway for any kinds of API solutions. So it doesn't matter whether you're using SOAP or whether you're using REST or whether even you're using some other kind of protocol maybe that you've thrown together based on XML or JSON or what have you. You can really use an XML gateway or a SOA gateway, like Layer 7 secure span solutions to actually give you the capabilities of effectively managing the access control to whatever your APIs are. So again, if you're an internet application with enterprise aspirations, what you really should be thinking about is the big picture of where you're going to be going in the future and what kinds of integrations you're actually going to have to think about. And so what I'm going to show you now then is an actual quick live demo where we're actually taking one of the Layer 7 gateways and putting it in front of an application. Now, I'm not using Facebook and Twitter now, but imagine the same kind of scenario where the client now is an application called Peaches, which is really just an integrator of all sorts of different peach recipes from all over the internet. And then I'm going to go to a recipe site, which actually has all sorts of different recipes, not just about peaches and that, but recipes about let's see, beef bourguignon and peach pie, and maybe how to do a good smoothie in the morning. So what I want to actually be able to do here is authorize the client so that it can access some of my recipes on that resource server. And in particular, allow it to actually get in and look specifically for the peaches recipe, because I really want to make my client into the one place you go for absolutely everything that you could ever want to know about peach recipes. So in other words, I'm consolidating information. I'm doing mashups really here. So where I'm using the Layer 7 gateway in this case is actually on that recipe server. So I'm actually putting it in front of that resource. So it's doing two things. It's acting both as an authorization server, so it's giving you the capabilities of actually managing those relationships, in this case with that client, the Peaches application. But it's also actually enforcing the entitlements and the authorization on any one of my different APIs. So in this case, that big database has APIs that allow you to query for different kinds of recipes. And I want enforcement there, not just using OAuth, but potentially using other kinds of security tokens as well, whether it's SAML or Kerberos or X509 digital certificates. Because that's very, very much about what the enterprise is running into today, is a recognition that there's a lot of different kinds of security tokens there, and they really need to handle all of them. The interesting new one, of course, is OAuth. But really, it stands within a continuum of a lot of existing ideas. And a good solution right here should be one that can actually embrace and really bridge many of these different approaches. So I'm going to show you right now a very, very simple kind of OAuth example. So bear with me for just a few minutes. And what I'm going to try to do, and I don't have a net here, so hopefully the whole thing is actually going to work out for me, is begin to share a few other applications so you can actually see my policy manager here. And I'll show you how I'm going to actually quickly set up a very, very simple OAuth scenario. Now, first of all, what you're seeing here is the Layer 7 Policy Manager, which is really the application that allows me to build up access control policies and build up enforcement policies in front of any kind of API. It also allows me to start to build up that whole authorization server policy, which can be used to bridge any kind of identity I want, whether it's OAuth, whether it's X509 certificates, whether it's Kerberos or username and password. And what we've done at Layer 7 is actually gone in and done a lot of specializations, not just around XML now, but around all the different kinds of security tokens. And in particular, what I want to do is I want to really quickly show you a couple of the different little components. And I want to touch on these really because part of our philosophy with OAuth right now is that this is a real moving target. And while in a lot of cases we can just give you a drop-in solution that allows you to do OAuth right away, the truth is if you're really thinking about OAuth from an enterprise perspective, the big picture of integrating with a lot of different people, you've got an integration problem because there's a lot of different OAuth and a lot of different perspectives on OAuth. And so what we did is we built the basic componentry of OAuth as a lot of sharp tools that you can slowly deploy in different formations and that, so you can deal with the integration problem. Anybody who tells you there's a one-size-fits-all solution to OAuth is lying to you. There is not a one-size-fits-all solution, particularly during this time of volatility. The truth is, interop in OAuth is hard right now. And so what we're giving you instead is a lot of the components so that you can actually customize your exact OAuth authorization so that it can deal with all of the different versions of tokens and little subtleties in terms of the OAuth dance back and forth between applications. Now, of course, we also give you the big picture. We also give you the basic pieces that just work as you drop them in. But where it really shines is as you get down into the weeds and that. As he said, when you have to really geek out, what you're going to be really happy with is the fact that you've got all the low-level stuff that you can bring to bear. Something like this, an assertion, a component. This is one of those sharp tools that actually goes back to just the very basics of how to do a security hash, where you can do something like give it some data that's resolved at runtime, a certain key, and then any one of a whole bunch of different potential hashes in that, whether it's HMAX, SHA-1, SHA-256, what have you. So again, you can start to customize. Same thing with something like this, generate signature-based OAuth, where you can start with the defaults, looking at things like the HTTP method and the URL, but you can also begin to customize it. You can get in there and override. You can begin to add additional headers, all of which are resolved at runtime. So you can begin to basically do that mix and match when you're handed an unusual token from, let's say, a business partner that you're working with. That could be a big social network or the next great web app that somebody's come up with. And they've already got an implementation, and they're sort of dictating to you what their OAuth looks like. This is when you're going to start to pull out these small, sharp tools, these components that actually allow you to go through and begin to do something like validate simple signatures, or even validate an OAuth token right here. So again, here you can pull in an actual token component from an actual piece of the message. It can be anywhere, regardless of whether it's message content hidden deep within a JSON data structure, or maybe something like a query parameter or an HTTP header. All of those are sources of information that you can mine and then start to pull together in all of these sharp little components. Now, if that seems too much like programming, I'm not actually going to apologize for that, because that's actually a good thing when you need it. But there's always a time when you don't need it, when you just need a simple drop-in sort of application. And this is exactly where these little components strung together already come in templates, where you can just drop them in for that 80% use case, which works most of the time. And that's actually exactly what I'm going to show you now. So bear with me for just another moment, and what I will try to do is share yet another application. And in this case, it's just going to be my web browser, which hopefully you can see right here. So what I'm going to do now is go to that actual application I was talking to you about earlier, which is the Peaches application. Okay? So this is my one-stop shop, my web app that actually integrates in Peaches recipes from all over the internet. And I'm going to go to one recipe app in particular. And what I've done here is try to make it deliberately simple and very, very manual. So I'm going to force a trigger right now, which actually goes through and starts to talk to the authorization server of that recipe application. Now, I'm also deliberately turning off SSL right here so that we can actually look down at the actual interchange and look at some of the tokens themselves. Don't have a lot of time for that right now, but maybe we could do that offline. So what I've done now is I've actually hit the actual authorization server, and this is part of that ceremony that I'm going to go through. So first of all, I'm going to log into it, and I'm actually hitting a Layer 7 gateway right now. And I'll log into it as my admin user right now, which is just my default for this. And what it's going to do is ask me, do I want to actually authorize this Peaches application? This is the scenario. Kept deliberately simple right now. Basically, I'm just going to say either yes or no. So in this case, I'm going to say yes, and what it does is redirect me right back to the Peaches application. And then underneath the hood, Peaches now has an OAuth token. And it's actually gone yet again back in the background using a web API to go and query that recipe database for the Peaches recipes that it's actually hosting. And in this case, it's how to make a peach pie. So a really very, very simple, trivial application here where we've just been able to drop in some technology in front of an existing recipe database that's hosting some APIs and give us that OAuth capability where we have both authorization servers there, but also the actual protection of those APIs, which includes not just the enforcement of tokens and things like that, but also the full audit lifecycle of who's accessing what and when. So with that, I'm going to start to hopefully take a few questions on that. I'd like to thank Eve again for joining me today. I'm glad everything worked out, even though we were, I think, Wi-Fi challenged at the beginning of the day. I think overall the whole thing went very, very well. Now we're coming up on the top of the hour here, so let me see if we've got any questions, very quickly that I could actually answer. And the first one is, actually, can Layer 7 integrate with a third-party authorization server? And the answer is yes, absolutely. We've been doing this kind of enforcement on services and APIs for many years. And a very important part of that, of course, is to be able to talk to virtually all of the existing identity and access management systems that are out there, whether it's everything from IBM's Tivoli TAM server to Oracle's Access Manager to generic LDAP to Microsoft's Active Directory. The truth is there's dozens of these things out there. And every time I think I've done an integration to every one of them, and I confidently say, yeah, we do them all, somebody comes up to me with an incredibly obscure one. And we find it takes about a week or something like that to actually get a customized integration. But truth be told, most of the big ones, certainly the ones I just mentioned now, we've got out-of-the-box integrations for. And so you can layer on top of that the OAuth, basically authorization server layer, or full STS that deals with things like SAML or sign-on with a number of other different kinds of tokens. So we're coming up on the end of the hour. I'd like to again thank Eve Mailer for joining me with this. I'll go through a lot of the questions later, and if we have time, I'll try to get back to people individually. So thank you again for everybody. If you want to listen to this webinar again, it will be archived on the Layer 7 site, and I hope I can talk to you again soon. Thank you, and have a great day.